Welcome to the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season is all about the 7 transitions of young adulthood, and today's episode is about the contributing transition. I'm your host, Roslyn Hernandez, and the young adults that we're going to hear from today are Christian, Myriam, Raechel, Faith, and Raye. But first, here is Steve with an overview of the contributing transition.
All right, so this season we're talking about young adults and transitions, and this time we want to talk about the contributing transition. You know, in our research, as we wrestled down the terms that we were going to use for our findings, this started out as the vocational transition. We thought it really focused on how young adults are thinking about their careers, which is actually part of the contributing transition, but we think it's a little bit broader than that. We would define the contributing transition as the way one's thinking about contributing to the world for the benefit of themselves and for others. It was about how I'm contributing or giving back to the world in my relationships and in my vocation, and just for the betterment of society. Young adults are thinking about that. And so this idea of contributing is bigger than one's job. It's young adults thinking about the fingerprint that they want to leave on this world, what they sense God is calling them to, what they want to give themselves to. So maybe you've experienced talking with some young adults when you ask them, well, what do you do? Or what are you going to do with your life? And they pause. It's not because they're not doing anything. That actually is quite a profound question for them. And if we give them space to unpack that, that can be really, really helpful. This idea of contributing sort of has 2 dynamics to it, as you can probably already tell. One is the aspirational dynamic. This idea of like, what do I really want to be about? What is God really calling me to? What do I resonate deeply with that I want to give myself to? There's another aspect of the contributing transition, and that is, how do I pay the rent? How do I put food on the table? There's a very practical element as well. So there's the practical and the aspirational that are always at play that young adults have to negotiate. And my guess is that if you were to talk to a young adult, you would almost hear both those aspects.
So as Steve mentioned, the contributing transition has a practical and an aspirational aspect. And sometimes this aspirational aspect can bring a lot of pressure for young adults. And this pressure that young adults might feel might come from very different places. It could be from themselves, from adults in their lives, peers, and even from society. So let's hear what Christian shared about the pressure of expectations in the contributing transition.
Yeah, so I am like a very type A person. I like to have a plan. And I think I've always been a person who's been highly driven, even from a really young age. And it felt important to me to do something that mattered in the world. And as I started to like go to school and experience some things didn't always meet my expectations. And so it felt like it was a constant like adjustment period where it felt like this high pressure to do something meaningful with my life. But there are so many different ways to do it. You're trying to balance like enjoying your life, contributing meaningfully, doing all of these things. And when you're in high school and planning all of these things out, how you imagine those things to be, it doesn't always actually work out in reality. We grew up in a world that tells you that like that you should do something that matters with your life. I feel like we hear that from parents and from teachers and all these different influences growing up. And there's a peer pressure to it too. When you hear what your friend's doing and the dreams that they have, I think it's also just something that's like kind of inherent in young people, that they've got this like hope and this drive generally to do something that matters. And so you feel all these pressures. And then now there's this like added pressure with social media where you see the way that people are living their dreams and doing whatever. And of course, we're only seeing the highlight reel, but we see people doing meaningful things and we feel the pressure to do that as well. When you're a young person, young adult years, all the way from like senior in high school to as you're like stepping into your first career, people are always asking you like what you're doing, like what are you doing, what's next. It's the primary way that people want to get to know you. It's the primary thing they want to know about you, and so it feels also so closely. It's like so tied in with your identity and your purpose in the world. And so then when you don't have a plan or the plans have changed, it feels so vulnerable to speak about that with other people, or even just to not have a clear plan at all. And then when you add the reality that we hope most young people have within the church is that like you also have this vision of like you're God's body, you know, you're God's hands and feet in the world, and that adds an extra layer of pressure that like society expects you to contribute in a meaningful way. Your parents, your peers expect you to contribute in a meaningful way. God expects you to contribute in a meaningful way. And so if you don't have a clear vision for what that is, that's so disorienting and confusing. And no one really tells you how to navigate that. They just expect you to have an answer. And so that's so challenging. And then it feels like you're on display as you navigate those things because everyone's asking about it all the time. So as a young person who's like not really sure what their path is or not really sure what's next, it feels so vulnerable to say that out loud because there's an expectation of an answer for those kinds of questions.
As we heard from Christian, it can be vulnerable to feel like you're expected to have an answer for questions like, what are your plans or what's next for you? But it's also hard when young adults find their career plans changing. This is what happened to Raechel. Her plans changed, but these changes aren't always just negative. They can also be helpful in the end. Here are Raechel's reflections about the changes in her plans and how those changes have influenced her faith.
I think part of like my journey with God and through my time as a young adult was kind of understanding what does it mean to surrender to God. And I think what happened was like I had this whole like plan of like, as a business major, the next steps for the next 5 years, get your internship, get your full-time job, get your MBA, get married, have kids, work in a corporate setting. And there was a time during college where I got really challenged in that. Through kind of going on outreach trips and serving with refugees and in different places, I felt like God challenged me to surrender some of those things. And that meant to consider like, what if I have something bigger for you? And it started with smaller things of like, are you willing to, set aside your thought of your plan of like taking a short summer break and, doing your internship at home and things like that, to like, are you willing to potentially, see your major and your industry as a missions field. Two, are you willing to potentially like consider being a full-time missionary and serving overseas in that context? And it went from like me being like, oh, that's not the plan, to like God working in a lot of my own process to say, okay, like I think there's this invitation to surrender something that feels very uncomfortable. The economics, like how your money comes in, relying on other people for your support potentially, not knowing how to explain yourself in different ways to others. I switched my focus to international business because I wanted to be able to create different avenues of like engaging with people cross culturally. And it's brought me into a place where right now I'm serving in a church. Like I work in an international ministry setting where I get to support missionaries in the mobilization aspect and their operations aspect, and to also like support kids and healthy ministry. God has brought out a lot of different ways to engage in my community in different settings, even now here. God has taught me a lot about what does it look like to be okay with the things that I thought were what I was supposed to do, and also wrestle with the parts of me that felt that tension of like, is it me that wants this? Do I feel peace about it? Or is it what I thought might be the safe option or be the thing that carries me into my next season?
While some young adults like Raechel might feel tensions related to changing their careers or how their contributions to their communities are different than the ways that they planned, other young adults like Myriam might have questions if their vocations or their contributions aren't as closely tied to ministry or their faith. Or they might just experience challenges in their careers, even if they do feel like they're making a difference or they're contributing in meaningful ways. This is what Myriam shared with us about her contribution as an intensive care unit nurse.
Yeah, so I'm working as a nurse now. I have been for about 2 years, and I feel like graduating from nursing school, it felt very clear. Like it was like, oh, this is obviously a place that you can work. And like we talked a lot at school. I went to a Christian school and talked a lot about like you're being the hands and feet of God and helping people and that kind of thing. So it seemed like a very obvious way to help people. But then actually starting my career, and I've been working in the ICU since I started, part of it is just that like we have such critically ill people, like either you see them die or they move to another floor and you never actually see them recover, and you're never interacting with them when they're not on the edge of dying. Yesterday at work, we had someone come back in after they had left and like came to show us that they're like, wow, like people actually do recover after they leave. But then I think just also a lot of trying to find meaning more in my church, because my job was very, like, I never struggled with what I was doing, and like people I feel like outside of the church too are like, oh, like that's a job that's meaning making. But then in like more Christian circles, I've struggled with like seeing other people in ministry, and it's like, well, how does working in a secular environment still cover your Christian calling, and in what ways I can be a Christian in that area? Because it's not as easy to like talk about faith or like how to approach it, or like even if I have time to do anything faith related.
Regardless of where or how young adults contribute to their relationships or communities or the world, feeling safe to explore is very important in this transition. Making plans and changing them can lead young adults to learn things that they didn't know about themselves. Like we heard from Raechel, change is not always a bad thing. It can be good for self-development. Here is Faith's reflection on self-discovery and changing trajectories.
I think for me in this transition, my 20s have been really pivotal in learning a lot about myself. So when I was like in high school and college, I felt like I had a really good idea of who I was, what I wanted to do. And the jobs that I took and the degree that I did was all kind of based around that. And then I ended up in a job that I felt wasn't really a good fit for me and kind of felt unqualified for. But through being in that job when I was about 21 and 22, I discovered I had this whole other set of gifts that I had like never been able to access or try before. And so through that process, I actually discovered that there was this whole other like trajectory, like vocational trajectory for my life that I had never considered because I had never been given the opportunities to try those things previously. And so I'm really grateful that in my 20s, I like had the flexibility to try different things. Because it really impacted like what I'm doing now and the direction that I'm moving in. I would have never, like in my teens and in college, I would have never guessed that I would be where I'm at and doing what I'm doing. But I think it really came from like almost trial and error a little bit of like trying different things and realizing, oh, I actually really do like that, or I'm good at this. And I can see my life moving in that direction.
Here are some of the things that are helpful for young adults in the contribution transition and the advice that we received from Myriam, Raye, and Raechel.
So I went to school in Iowa and then moved out to Denver directly after that. And moving out here, I didn't know anyone, but I knew of this church, and some people that I knew told me about this program that they were allowing young adults to live in their old parsonage. It's called the Enfold program, to enfold them into their church. And so they connected us all with a mentor, and then just like we're very intentional about trying to include us in our church, and having the support built in so much moving into a new area was helpful. And then especially because the mentors they connected us with were all within like a similar field that we were working with. So they paired me with another nurse in the church. So someone who had more of an idea, like career-wise, like someone to walk alongside of you. A lot of the times I would have preferred more like direct answers, but just having someone who's like, yeah, I struggle with the same things. Just having other people recognize that they're 10 or 15 years into the career and still questioning the same things is supportive.
I think for a lot of youth and even friends that I know right now too, there's a lot of this expectation that we're talking about that things have to be figured out. And even for me, there's a comfort knowing like, oh, I'm not alone in this, that everyone else, like all my young adult peers are going through something very similar. And yeah, so to feel the camaraderie and companionship of just other peers as we're walking along this process. And so just recognizing it's like this whole humanity transition, this whole like life process that we're all in that is just transition and the stability, destabilizing and restabilizing. And that's just like an ongoing process that we continue through.
So I think one of the things that could be helpful for leaders who are walking with people who are going through transition or kind of meaning making or contributing is to affirm the different things that are on your heart, that are passions or things that people are dreaming about, whether or not it's concrete or not practically in the world for your like your workplace or different things. I struggle with like being confident in myself and what I have to contribute in these things as a unique individual and learning to embrace those things. I think it's really helpful for a leader to call those things out and to empower. And I also think it's really important for leaders to recognize their own personal bias or their own narrative and how it paints how they react or respond to somebody else's process. Just because you might have come from a different background or a different setting doesn't mean that that person doesn't have something to contribute to the larger world in a different way. Because if you're a leader in a church, it can oftentimes feel like, oh, my limitation is only within this church setting or this space. But how do you help somebody else dream in a bigger way if it goes beyond just that? And I think that is how we can be the hands and feet of Jesus, by understanding like the larger body of Christ and how each person contributes to that. It can look completely different than what your local church or your local denomination or your community can look like. And so how do we empower and equip somebody to go further? Like, how do you be the shoulders that they stand on to continue to further the larger body of Christ?
Hey, so I'm back to tell you, if you're really liking the content that you're hearing in this season, we want to hook you up with a really helpful resource. It's a guide titled 7 Things You Need to Know for Successful Young Adult Ministry. This guide covers the transitions that we're talking about in the season, but it also gives you practical questions to help you engage young adults. You can download this guide at youngadultministrynext.com. I mean, you don't have to go right now, but you could. But do come back. Like, make sure you come back after you get it, because you want to hear the next part. And now here is a wrap-up conversation with Steve. Welcome back to the wrap-up conversation for the contributing transition.
Contributing
transition, yes. So what else came up in the research that we probably didn't hear in our roundtable discussion with the young adults?
Yeah, so I think the contributing transition is really unique. As I mentioned in the intro, like a lot of times when we think about contributing, we just think about vocation or job. And I think that's really, really important for us to pay attention to, because we found through the interviews that a lot of times young adults want to contribute to something that they've had an experience in.
Yeah.
Right? So if they've been moved by an experience or someone has helped them in a particular way or helped them through a particular challenging time, they want to almost contribute to or give back to that. So if I'm a young adult and I had a great counseling experience, sometimes that makes me wonder if I want to pay it forward by being a counselor. We had others that were even incarcerated, and we're thinking about, well, what does it mean for me to give back to others who have been incarcerated so that they may have a hopeful journey even in the midst of what they've gone through as well. So I find that really interesting and really helpful and important for a couple of reasons. one, as we think about ministry, I think a lot of times what we say to young adults is like, well, what do you want to do with your life? Which is the most terrifying question
So daunting.
you can give them. So daunting, right? And this little side note, like, don't ask that question like on graduation. Like, hey, you just completed this great thing. Now what are you going to do with your life, right?
The rest of your life.
I know, right? Like that, like you can just see the countenance in young adults going, oh, please don't ask me that
Yeah.
question, right? I've actually said to young adults, like, everyone's probably asking you what you want to do with your life. And you can just, they go, yeah. I'm like, I'm not going to ask you that. And they're like, thank you. But maybe a better question might be to say, so tell me about some of the highlights in your life that have really inspired you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and I think one of the things that we can do as we mentor young adults is to help young adults begin to reflect on the spaces and experiences that have moved them, that probably in some way are inspiring them to lean toward what they want to do. It's the themes in our lives that help us with our callings. I mean, sometimes I tell my students, like, we don't really find our calling. I think our calling finds us.
Yes.
Right? You agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do we help young adults do that? Another thing that I've been telling young adults to do, this is my latest jam. This is like hot off the press. Okay?
All right.
Like I tell young adults,
Exclusive.
like especially like family gatherings, everything else. I've been telling young adults, when adults ask you what you're doing with your life, your job is not to report to them. Right? This feeling of like, I have to say the right thing, or I have to like, I'm doing this job, or this is how I'm being a good person in society or whatever. Like we kind of feel like we have to report to older people, right? Now, again, older types, I'm an older type. We don't intend anything by it. We're actually looking for ways to find commonality. I think that's what's actually going on. But a young adult can feel this sense of, I've got to like, I guess now's the moment I've got to report like where I'm at in life in this moment, right? Instead of reporting, I've been encouraging young adults to not report to young adults, but to educate young adults. To say to them, when an adult says, well, what are you doing with your life? To say to them, let me tell you a little bit about what I've been studying and the work that I'm doing that's starting to help me think about the ways that I'm investing my life in the future. I haven't quite figured it out yet, but here's some ways that I'm thinking about it, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. Notice the difference? There's a sense of context. And so what a young adult is doing to an adult is educating them on their lives, so the conversation shifts from reporting to actually educating. And when that educating happens, it helps the adult find things to talk about, and the conversation becomes much more generative.
Right.
Isn't that
It's
cool?
more of a posture of conversation
Yes.
rather than interrogation.
Right, exactly. And I love that, right? Because it feels like interrogation.
Yeah.
And this contributing transition is really, really important, because if it is more than one's job, when we talk with young adults, we're actually inviting them to talk about what's really important to them, of how they want to make a difference in the world. Now, they may not use those terms or whatever, but let's be honest, we all want to do something significant.
Right.
Like, none of us are going, yeah, I kind of want to coast through life and do as little as possible and hopefully make it at the end. Like, most people are not going to say that. Most of us like want our lives to count in some sort of way. And that's the contributing transition. For a young adult, this is a transition because there's so many options that it can be overwhelming for a young adult. And it's this overwhelming feeling that sometimes makes it hard for them to answer that question.
You know, something along with that I think is really helpful for us to remember as adults is that we contribute to society, to the world, to others in different ways at different stages of our lives. So sometimes when that question gets asked of what are you going to do when you grow up, or what are you going to do with your life, it seems like you're going to choose that one thing and it's the only thing you're going to do for until you die, you know? And that's not the case. God can ask us and invite us into different stages and different missions or different callings at different times.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the beauty of that is that there's more ways to express our callings than ever before, which is really great. It's also a little overwhelming. But we were just all talking before we were doing this recording about the fact that the world is changing so fast that this contributing transition for young adults is especially acute. because whatever they've been trained in is going to be obsolete quicker than generations ago, where I could choose one thing and do it for 30 years and get a pension at the end. That's not the world anymore. So the senior seminars that I hear being taught in universities is, how do I become a lifelong learner? How do I become adaptable? How do I keep current with whatever field that I'm in so that I do not become obsolete? Think about that for a second, of what that means for a young adult. That they never quite make it. Like there's this treading water almost of swimming upstream that has to happen, otherwise you can fall behind. So there's this pent-up anxiety that comes with that as well. And I'm all about lifelong learning, but that's a challenging thing to think about, the fact that the work that we do can be obsolete in a short amount of time. So this contributing transition adds a lot of texture and challenge and beauty, all sort of wrapped up in one. So maybe if we had a more conversational way of talking with young adults rather than interrogational, as you said before, I think there's the possibility for that. And then I think we serve young adults really well.
Yeah, so let's summarize it for our audience,
so good at that.
right? One tip, change the posture from interrogation to conversation.
Yes.
What other tips?
Again, for young adults, educate rather than report. You do not have to report. I think that's really great. I also would say that there's something about contributing where we can use with young adults process language rather than arrival language. So instead of saying, what do you do? Like, and an emerging adult or young adult will usually say, well, which of the 3 jobs do you want me to tell you? Exactly. Say, so what are you learning? What's something that's exciting that's going on? Notice the difference that when we use process questions, we acknowledge the fact that this contributing element is along the way. And I think that opens up room for young adults to actually share what they're doing rather than thinking that you're looking for one answer.
I think the last thing I would add that I found very helpful when I was in seminary, we had this guiding question that we did at the end of our first year, and it's at this point in my spiritual journey, what is God calling me to right now?
Say that again.
At this point in my spiritual journey, and I would, in my journey, because everything is spiritual. At this point in my journey, what is God calling me to or inviting me to right now?
I love that question, and I'm glad you added that. And I think what we can do as adults and leaders is ask that question to young adults, but then answer it ourselves. And I think that posture shows that maybe it's not the same level of contributing transition that we're going through that young adults are, but we're still in process as well. And I think it models lifelong learning.
Yes, lifelong learning.
Yay!
As an Enneagram 5, I'm a lifelong learner.
Yes, you are.
Yes, I am.
I can attest to that.
Well, thanks so much for watching this contributing episode. That is all we have for you today. Remember to like, share, hit the notification bell, subscribe, everything. Send it to your grandma, send it to your uncle, send it to your cousin.
Share it everywhere.
Everybody, yes. And let us know what you think in the comments. So stay awesome.
Peace.
Bye. This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. Check out the show notes for links to all of the resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you want to not just listen, but also watch this podcast, you can go find us on the Fuller Youth Institute YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening or watching.